Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today we have Gerry Friesen back. So happy to have you, Gerry. How are you doing?
Hey, Tracy, I'm doing well, and it's always a pleasure talking to you.
Yes, it's been too long. I'm excited and double excited because you have some good news that we're going to share in just a bit. Before we go there, for our new audience members, as our show is always growing, can you tell our audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then we'll walk into your journey and some of the great news you have to share.
Sure, sounds good, Tracy. My name, like you said, is Gerry Friesen. Excuse me. I call myself the recovering farmer. That's because I used to farm. I don't anymore. And so when my farming career ended back in 2007, I had already got involved in conflict management work. So I do a lot of mediation work. But also, as we'll learn later, I got involved in the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line, really got a passion for mental wellness and agriculture. And that's largely due to, again, what I experienced when I was farming and the journey I'm on today.
Excellent. So, a few places I want to go with this conversation. You have been advocating, telling your story, supporting farmers through hard times by sharing your story. And I know we're going to talk about that in a bit, but it's not easy to be a farmer. As we all know, there's so many things out of our control, ups and downs, our identities meshed in with it. You made the very hard decision, or I'm saying hard, you made the very brave decision years ago to say, hey, I went through a hard time and I want to talk about it. So, with May being Mental Health Month, why don't you share why you first shared your story and why you continue to do so?
What's interesting, Tracy, that you say I wanted to share my story.
Okay.
Actually, that's not the way it came about.
Okay.
What
Good
happens
question.
is, what happens is I seem to lack the ability to say no when someone asks me to do something. And so back in 2010, actually, I had been contracted by the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line, which it was called at the time, to facilitate workshops, and they were specifically geared for men and depression, agricultural producer men and depression. And the manager of the farmline at the time said that what she would really like is if a farmer could tell their story of challenges, particularly with their mental health. And so I said, okay, I'd think about that. I'd see if I could think of someone to do that. A day or two later, I had no idea because, of course, back then nobody talked about it. But she was quite intimately aware of my journey at the time, so she asked me whether I would, and I said yes. And again, not thinking about the implications. But what happened, Tracy, is I started talking about it. I did some interviews. I was on a call-in radio show, and ultimately did a presentation for the kickoff of these workshops at Ag Days in Brandon, and the response was quite frankly overwhelming. You know, and I realized very quickly that when I started opening up and started talking about it, so did other people. And just by virtue of that, when other people opened up, then we talk to each other, we have the conversation, and we learn from each other.
I love that. And I'm just reflecting back to our many episodes together already, and a lot of them covering your story. And I know we've chatted about this, but just that power in like the Me Too, right? It's like as soon as you know you're not alone in something and you're not the only one that feels that way, you just share the load, right? It's just, it's
Yes.
not.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I keep challenging people. I say, when we get into that state, whether it's overwhelming stress or it's even gone a little bit further and is a lot of anxiety, maybe even hinging on depression, we have all these thoughts running around in our heads, and very often those thoughts just absolutely drive us around the bend. And I often say that when we verbalize these thoughts, when we put them out there, a couple of things happen. Number one, they're out there, which eases the burden. Number two is very often when we start verbalizing these thoughts, we understand how ridiculous some of those thoughts are. And when we hear ourselves say it, it's kind of you take a step back and go, what, really? I really was thinking that, and I really believed that that was going to happen. And so it's really a way of getting those thoughts under control.
I love it. Okay. So,
But just, sorry, just something, I was going to say something further to that, Tracy.
yeah.
Over the years, of course, a lot of people have asked me, how come you have the freedom to talk about mental illness, and particularly my own? And I often wondered about that. And then one day it actually occurred to me that the fact that I was sharing openly and freely about my mental illness actually gave me freedom.
Oh.
Because we have a tendency to isolate ourselves. I sometimes, and even in my book, I talk about being in a closet. And that's where we like to hide when the stuff is going on. And yet I came to the realization that when I talked about it, I was actually taking myself out of that closet and felt a lot freer because it was out in the open. I wasn't hiding anything. And
Mm,
so there's a freedom in actually stepping out and talking about it.
interesting. And that's a bit counterintuitive until you do it, right? It's like, no,
Absolutely.
I just want to hide. I know, me
Yeah,
too. Stuff is bothering me. I still have that natural inclination to, I just want to pull away and then sort it out, right? But it's only when you actually verbalize it that I go, oh, right?
absolutely, for sure.
Okay. So, are we ready to share the good news? And then I want to weave into a little bit of your story again, which I think you naturally will. Are you ready for me to announce it, Gerry?
Go for it, Tracy.
I have the very exciting news to, I have the very exciting honor to announce the news that Gerry has written a book titled The Recovering Farmer: A Journey Through the Labyrinth of Anxiety and Depression. So I'm excited to announce that. And I also want to congratulate you, Gerry. I know your journey, and you've had a challenging one. You've been so brave and just stepping up to the plate and sharing. This book that I'm excited to read, I know it's going to be amazing. I think is going to be a valuable tool for our industry. So, congratulations, Gerry.
Thank you, Tracy. It was an interesting experience, to say the least.
I believe it. Do you want to share? How did it come about? Why did you do it? And do you want to talk a little bit about the book? Kind of, we don't want to give the whole book, but just when somebody opens the cover of that book, what can they expect?
Yeah, and you know what? That's a really interesting question, Tracy, because and why did I do this? I'm not sure. For people that know me, for people that have followed me on social media, for example, since 2010, I was writing blogs fairly regularly. Um, Somehow that expanded to something a little bit bigger. Again, people, I would share experiences and someone would say, well, you should write a book. And I guess people said that often enough to the point where I did write a book. I struggled at the outset because I wasn't sure what I was writing. Um, Sometimes I thought it was a memoir. Other times I thought, well, maybe these are farm stories. And then sometimes I thought, well, maybe it's a self-help book. And so I was a little confused about that till someone suggested to me one day that it could be all three.
Mm,
And when I heard that, I went, oh, okay, because then a lot of the I sometimes call it gobbledygook that I write started making sense when I put it into that. So then it became a matter of, well, how can I tell my story without overwhelming people? I'm not academic. I told someone the other day I didn't use any big words in this book. I like to just, and people that listen to me talk know that I like to tell stories. I like to keep things simple. And so that's what I did. But in that journey also is when I would sit down and talk about it. And and there's a part in there about addictions. I mean, I don't shy away from the fact that I had a, a substance abuse issue. I found out in my life that drinking alcohol did a great job of easing anxiety. Unfortunately, when alcohol leaves the body, that increases anxiety. It's the hangover effect, and so the only way to combat that was to drink more, which I did. Um, but part of so when I was reflecting on the past, sometimes when I would think about some of these things, and of course, an alcohol abuse situation can wreak havoc on relationships. It wreaks havoc on everything in life. And so when I would reflect on that, of course, that would give me pause, and I would go, well, really, do I want to go there? But the other piece that really came about is I found out that writing about it, and this encouraged me during the process, was that it was quite therapeutic, actually. And part of that is the fact that people with mental illness, like I do, with anxiety and depression, often reflect on life and think it was a waste. And so they just have these negative thoughts about the past. And I started when I was reflecting on the past and wanting to write about it. Suddenly, all these positive experiences also came out. And so not only did I realize my life hadn't been a waste, but I also realized that there had been positive, in spite of all the negative stuff that happened, which I quite freely talk about in the book, there was also lots of positive stuff that happened as well.
Beautiful. That would have been a nice blessing for you too, right? I know the power. Gerry, I got to hop in there really quick. I know the power of reading a powerful book that changes your life. And when I asked you why a book, I know why a book, because even if I listen to an audiobook, read somebody's blog, hear them speak, something about a book, it's just so personal and tangible. And then on the flip side, I know about the power of journaling and how that would have just popped things in your mind where you're like, oh, I didn't look at it that way. Wow. So amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, and like I said, in the journaling piece, and I talked about this to someone yesterday, is I often challenge people to journal when they're experiencing stress, when they're experiencing anxiety, depression, because journaling can be quite helpful. And I have a difficult time doing that on a daily basis, but when I was writing the blog and posting it basically weekly, that was my form of journaling and putting these thoughts down on paper again. It's almost like we talked about before, where verbalizing these thoughts in your head can really, shed light on what's true and what's perceived. And so that's what I was doing with that. I just took it one step further.
Nice. So in there, and you've kind of touched on it, you share your journey and the details and the hard times. I know in our different conversations, you've shared some stuff that's helped you. It sounds like you share some stories in here. What else? What can readers expect if they're going through the book? Kind of the light.
Well, and I guess to a degree, I want it to be entertaining. Uh, to a degree, I want it to have an impact, and to a degree, I want it to be helpful for people. Again, very often, folks with a situation with their mental illness, like I have, often feel that they're alone. Um, I want them to know that's not the case. I want them to know that there's others that experience what they're experiencing. And I share some stories in there about my farm debt mediation work, Tracy. And again, part of my journey involves the fact that I was farming and that we had some significant financial trouble on the farm. And while I was experiencing that on my own farm, I was working with farm families on their farms through this farm debt mediation. And it was interesting the connection I was able to make when I would be sitting across the farm table from a couple, for example. And one story I tell briefly in the book is about this farmer that pulled out a letter he had received from the credit union where they were going to start the receivership process. In other words, they were staring bankruptcy right in the eyeball, and he read this letter to me, and his voice was breaking because, of course, it's the identity you talked about before, right? And when he was done reading, I looked at him and I said, "This is what I did when I had got a similar letter from my credit union." And his mouth just dropped, and he said, "You know what I'm talking about?" Because of course he felt that nobody else knew, nobody else was going through this, they were alone, right? And we have that tendency to do that. So there's a message in there that you're not alone.
I love it. What would you say was the hardest part of writing the book? What would you say? Did you get stumped up?
Sorry, I laugh because
Sometimes.
I acknowledge in the book that writing a blog, which was always right around 600 words, was easy for me, because I say when my train of thought leaves the station and I'm actually on it, I'm good for 600 words before it gets to the next station. Um, keeping the thoughts flowing, keeping the thoughts linear, um, making sure things made sense was really difficult. And again, very much like my own personal journey, it is, where do you start? And once you have a starting point, how do you carry on? Because I'm at the age now, and I before we started, I told you a story about buying a pop and a bag of chips for 25 cents. That tells people how old I am. You know, yeah, my journey literally started when I was born, type of thing. And so as and this is the interesting part, and maybe I'm going here before I should, but I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression by a doctor in 2004 while I was farming. And so, of course, the doctor prescribed me antidepressants. And I went on those, and I often say that was a recovery part of my journey. But it was in 2007 when I got involved with the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line that I started the discovery part of my journey. And that is where I found out about mental illness, and I found out all the intricacies that can happen when you're in the depths of this. And this is when I could start connecting dots. So that made me reflect and realize that I was probably dealing with a lot of this when I was young, when I was 6, 7 years old, when I was a teenager. I was already experiencing anxiety. Now, part of part of the book is the fact that I grew up in a fundamental Mennonite home. And so back then, of course, the anxiety I felt, I was contributing that to the guilt.
Yeah.
I, and I would confess things, and things wouldn't get better, to the point where, and I had to learn this on my own, was the fact that, hey, yeah, I probably got guilt because I've done a lot of things I probably shouldn't have done. But ultimately, the churning I was feeling was I was experiencing anxiety.
Yeah. And it's funny, Gerry, that I think now, in large part to the work that you're doing, Do More Egg, all these great associations. I mean, it's out there. There's books out there. But what, 5, 10 years ago, this was all hush hush. And if we don't even know the language to put to this, we just don't know what we're experiencing or where to start, right?
Exactly. You're exactly right. And part of my message is, and I think I've said this to you before, Tracy, and it certainly is in the book, is the fact that, oh shoot, I can't even begin to account how many medical appointments or professionals I've seen to help me. And it was only actually 6 years ago that I finally found someone that was could connect dots for me. And so they didn't heal me that day, but they connected dots, which gave me even a better understanding, which I needed to be able to move forward in a much more positive way. And so my message in the book is that if the first appointment doesn't work, don't give up. Carry on. But that's also in large part why I was a co-founder of the Manitoba Farmer Wellness Program, because I knew firsthand the difficulties of getting an appointment. Number one. Number two is finding an appointment with someone that understood agriculture. And in fact, I went to see a psychologist at one point in my journey, early in my journey after 2004, who had no concept of agriculture. And when my hour was up with him, he said, "You better go on medication because you can't afford me." And it was like, are you kidding me? I was devastated. Of course, I thought I was a hopeless case, but that was because there was a complete and total lack of understanding of agriculture. So that's why I'm so passionate about the Farmer Wellness Program, of course.
Yeah. Um, why don't you do you want to give a shout out to Manitoba Farmer Wellness? Because this is an important part of your journey too. Just like your journey, walking the path, sharing, and then speaking, and then founding the organization, and now writing the book. Let's talk about that part because that's important for our audience too.
Well, it is, and it's called the Manitoba Farmer Wellness Program. And Tracy, you've been kind enough to have us on your show more than once to talk about it. You talked about Do More Ag. There's a Canadian Center for Agricultural Well-being. Their national organization's doing a great job in promoting mental well-being in agriculture. Um, but there was an understanding in our province here, and other provinces are jumping on board with this as well, is to provide a little bit longer term. We have a crisis line, the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line, although it's called something different now. But we have and that's a crisis line. But now we have in place a program where farmers, their families, and employees can get free sessions with a counselor. And we have 4 counselors that we've retained that have this agricultural knowledge that's so important to help people move forward.
Perfect. And so valuable too. And we've said this in those episodes where if you share with non-farming friends and family, they mean well, but they make those off the cuff remarks that just deal with it or whatever. I can't think of what they are right now, where it makes you feel rejected, not heard, not understood, whatever emotion that you want to put to that. So the fact that it's somebody that's trained with an agriculture background, then they get it, right? And
Yeah,
I mean, chances
yeah.
are, Gerry, let's be truthful. Chances are, if somebody is in a state of anxiety, depression, worse, I'm going to guess there is money involved in that state. That's the world we live in, right? We get really stressed when things aren't going well on the farm. So you say to somebody that they need to pay, it's like, oh, I can't afford that. That doesn't make it's not logical, right? Like, so anyway, sorry, just a little
Well, no,
tangent
no,
there.
you're absolutely right, Tracy, and that is because it's not it's not a priority for people. Um, I
Right.
mean, if you have to pay a counselor, and I don't know what the going rate is, 80 to $100 an hour, if you have to pay them that, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And yet we have no issue going out and buying a new tool for $100 or $200. And I keep saying that being mentally well is one of the most important tools, if not the most important tool that you can have in your toolbox.
Breach.
And Farm Management Canada did a study a few years ago, and they say that research shows that mentally well farmers will be more profitable,
Absolutely.
because it's very, very difficult when we're experiencing this overwhelming stress or anxiety or even depression. It's incredibly difficult to make decisions, and farmers have to make more and more decisions on an annual basis. It's absolutely mind-boggling, but it's more difficult to make decisions because and Tracy, you and I did a show a few years ago called The Tale of Two Brains or something, and that's the irrational brain and the rational brain. And when we're under stress, the irrational brain has this tendency to kick in, and we start making decisions on for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, you got me going.
We do that to each other. Rabbit trail, come back, best episodes. So, Gerry, two things. One, somebody is going to grab your book, and we're going to talk about that right at the end. But they grab this book. What do you hope they think, feel, take away when they close that cover? What's that? What's that feeling? Thought?
I hope, first and foremost, Tracy, I hope they have a smile on their face. Um, because they will have read some stuff, and as you know, I like to use humor, and I know that there's a whole story behind the humor thing, and that it could be hiding deeper issues, and nine times out of ten it does for me. Um, but I want them to read through it, and there are chapters in there which are going to probably bring a tear to people's eyes. There's a chapter on suicide, and it can be emotionally not devastating, but certainly bring your emotions to the forefront. There's stuff on addictions, like I talked about. There's these things that I experienced when I was farming, and I talk about being an overthinker, and I talk about dissociation with myself, and I talk about not having healthy coping skills. All of these things can be sad, perhaps, or not done in a happy place. But there's also other stories in there that I hope will bring a smile to people's faces, because there is some humor in that in there as well. But ultimately, what I want people to see is that yes, I'm on a journey. I say at the beginning that I would like to start this book with "Once upon a time" and end it with "I lived happily ever after." That's not the reality. Spoiler alert: it doesn't end that way. But rather what it is it's the journey continues, and I've learned so much, and I found myself actually, and someone laughed at a colleague of mine, a friend of mine actually laughed at me the other day because I said, you know what, I have this feeling inside of me and I think it's joy. And she said, oh my God, you're flirting with joy. you know but that's what this journey is about, and the more I learn and the more tricks I do, and the more my I call her my therapist. She's actually a naturopath doctor, believe it or not, who finally connected dots for me, and who's been amazingly helpful for me on my journey. As I do all of these things, and my life is better due to everything I've experienced, positively or negatively, in life.
Beautiful. I love it. Okay. Before we talk about how people can get their hands on a copy, let's say we're at an event, you just gave a speech, okay? And then somebody catches you in the dark corner outside and they're going through a hard time, and you just have a few minutes before you got to go over there, and they just have a few minutes. What words of wisdom do you give to that individual that's in a bad place? What would you say to them?
I would say it's okay not to be okay. I would say it's okay to reach out for help. And I would say, man, you've got to talk about it. Because it's in talking about it that we gain that freedom that I've found when I started talking about it. Can I be helpful to these people? I'd like to think I can because of my own personal experiences and some of the training I've had. But I'd also challenge them to seek further help. And people sometimes think that going to see a therapist is something that's going to be a long term, long drawn out affair. And it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It's interesting what even one appointment can do. And I relate the story of when at one point I was finding myself sliding down that hill again. And I said to a friend and colleague, I said, boy, I wonder if I need to make an appointment. And they said, absolutely, make an appointment. And so I picked up the phone, I made an appointment with a psychologist, and just the act of making that appointment already started making me feel better, because I think we have this tendency, and people again with anxiety in particular, and I just saw a reel last night about this, is we feel something and instantly we catastrophize, and we think something awful is going to, it's got to be awful. And so when I was starting to think about, oh no, here I go again, I have to make an appointment, it all felt overwhelming. And yet taking that one step can already start easing that burden. And you know what? It's like our vehicles, it's like our farm equipment, Tracy. When and I shouldn't use this example, but when the check engine light comes on in my car, what do I do? Well, what no. Let me rephrase it. What should I do? I don't do it. What should I do is I go
Take
to
it
a
to the
garage,
shop.
right?
Yeah.
Yes. And sometimes the check engine light comes on for me in my body or in my brain. And so I need to be proactive and go and get this checked out. And very often, guess what? It's not a huge thing that has to be dealt with. You know, when you take your vehicle into the garage and they hook up something and they check their computer and they hit a switch and boom, you're good to go, right? Very often it's that simple with a therapist as well.
Perfect. Those are great words. Thank you for sharing that. As we know, Gerry, and it's going to change because we're talking about it, opening those conversations up. But farming hasn't been, isn't, and will probably always continue to be challenging just because of good old Mother Nature. I mean, that alone we can't control. So that's one of our biggest variables. So these conversations, your organization, this book, it's all valuable, valuable tools. If somebody wants to get their hands on a copy, how can they do so? And when can
They
they?
can they can go to my website, gerryfriesen.ca. There's a little bit more information on the book there. There's also links to Friesen Press, who published this, and to Amazon to order a copy. I know those shipping fees can be rather extravagant. Is that the right word? And so if people want a copy of my book, my email address is in there. They can send me an email and I will do what I can to get them a book.
Okay.
In addition to that, Tracy, on my website also there is, and you and I have done a number of interviews in the past. They're all on there. And in fact, there's one that you did for me in November of 2018, I believe it was, where I really started opening up, and that interview is on there. And then also I've done interviews for the Stigma Free Society, and those interviews are on there. There's a couple of videos about me telling my story. There's my blogs are up there. There's all kinds of information that people can look into and see what they like and what they don't like.
Lovely. Gerry, thank you for coming on the show again. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for coming on episodes. And most of all, thank you for writing this book because I know personally books have changed my life. I wouldn't be who I am today without the experiences and wisdom that people have shared along the way. Oh, I'm getting goosebumps. So, thank you for doing that because I know this book is going to be something like people can just read and go, oh, wow, this hits me in the heart. So, thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity, Tracy, and I always enjoy the conversations you have. And just so you know, Tracy, that on the last page of my book, there's a poem in there called Don't You Quit.
Oh, beautiful. Beautiful.
And you and I both like that poem, and I'll recite it for you right now.
Oh,
Is when life gets rough, as it sometimes will, when the road you're traveling seems all uphill, when funds are low and debts are high, you'd like to smile, but you have to sigh. When care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but don't you quit.
beautiful. Oh my goodness, Gerry. Oh, that was lovely. This episode has been amazing and I can't wait to crack that cover and read through a copy of the book too. Thank you, Gerry, for joining us.
Thanks, Tracy.
You're welcome. You in the audience. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. If you liked it, like it, share it, get it out there. And most importantly, get your hands on a copy of the book. I know it will change lives. Thank you guys and see you next week. Bye-bye.